Last time, I began the story of how God truly saved me from long COVID. This was in October of 2023. I had COVID in July of 2022 and was sick with long COVID ever since. I had lost 45 pounds, slept 12 to 15 hours a day, couldn't remember things from one day to the next, had heart palpitations, stomach trouble, and intermittent muscle pain that was so severe at times I couldn't drive. I was dying. In addition, I had lost my job, exhausted my savings, and the short-term disability insurance company was playing games with me. Then God intervened. Hey, I'm author Michael Ramsey, and this is Michael Ramsey Books, where I show people how to transform their ordinary relationship with God into a spiritual one. If you haven't already subscribed, be sure to hit the red subscribe button and ring the notification bell now. 1 Corinthians 2:15. A spiritual man discerns all things, but he himself is to be judged by no one. Sandy, a dear friend of mine who has a heart for God, called me one evening out of the blue. I hadn't talked to her in months, long before I became seriously ill and stopped working. I told her about my ordeal with long COVID and my desperate financial situation, and she graciously offered to make my house payments for me. I thanked her for her generous offer, but told her that wouldn't be necessary. The Lord God provides for me. A few days later, Sandy felt a strong urge to go to a Friday night Bible study. She used to go to this Bible study on a regular basis before COVID shut everything down back in 2020. And even though the Bible study had started back up again, she hadn't been back since. At the end of the Bible study, the leader of the group asked for prayer requests. There were several things Sandy needed prayers for, but something inside her said, Mike. And so she told the group about me and requested prayers on my behalf. She didn't even mention any of her own needs. The next day, a man from the Bible study, whom I had only briefly met a long time ago, got my number from Sandy and called me. When the phone rang, I didn't take the call. I didn't know who it was. And even though he left me a nice voicemail, I didn't call him back. A few days later, he called again. Again, I didn't answer. And again, he left me a nice voicemail. But this time, because there was an urgency in his voice, my spirit moved. It was the Lord speaking to me. He said, "You need to call him back." And so I did. The man from the Bible study, my new best friend, asked me not to use his name in this video. Like Sandy, he's also a doctor. He does research at a world-renowned cancer treatment hospital here in Houston. Celebrities and world leaders from across the globe come to Houston when they're diagnosed with the big C. Now, the reason I can't tell you my new best friend's name is because his employer would not be the least bit happy if they knew he was giving any kind of advice that deviates from the COVID narrative. Nevertheless, my friend told me there is an antidote for long COVID. That's right, I said antidote, not cure. That's because COVID is not a disease. It is a poisoning. The fact that COVID isn't a disease didn't surprise me. I've known for quite some time there's no such thing as a virus. I first learned this watching Dr. Sam Bailey videos. When I see these kinds of videos, I can easily discern truth. My spirit senses these things. And that's because it's not just spiritual things that a spiritual man discerns. A spiritual man discerns all things, 1 Corinthians 2:15. This includes things of the world. But you don't have to be a spiritual man or a spiritual woman to perceive this truth, nor do you need any kind of supernatural ability to see through the theories of natural men. Just do a little research for yourself. If your heart is open to the things of God, it's easy to see. At a minimum, Google virus image. What do you see? Drawings and computer-generated images, CGI. Other than the occasional liposome, which is man-made, and the occasional blob of something that could be anything, there's nothing. Even the images of the coronavirus from the official CDC website don't look quite right to me. There's too few, and they're too perfect. You would think, at least I would, with the technology we have today, electron scanning microscopes using various forms of microscopy, things that can see into an atom, there'd be tons of pictures of these things, but there's not. And by the way, the images on the CDC website are stated to have been taken with an electron scanning microscope. So once again, why aren't there more? With the trillions and trillions we've spent on this delusion, why is it we have less than a handful of pictures, all of which were taken at the very beginning of the pandemic? And these images have long since been archived. If you're willing to have a look-see for yourself, it's easy to see. Not only are there no pictures, but there's also no reasonable evidence supporting this debunked theory, which was proposed in the early 1900s, shot down, then readopted in the mid-1900s, even though there was no new evidence. The reason the theory was resurrected was because it was needed to support new initiatives that would supposedly protect people from pieces of organisms that are just kind of floating around. So once again, this makes no sense to me. If it's not a virus that makes people sick, what could it be? It's simple. Diseases caused by an exposure to something the body doesn't like a toxic substance. But most of the time, it's something you can't see: extreme temperature, radiation, parasites, fungus, or bacteria. An open wound, bad water, bad food, bad hygiene, and filthy living conditions are an open invitation for infection. These are the most likely suspects. Some types of bacteria can cause organ damage. Some types disrupt vital bodily functions. Other types cause a disruption within the microbiome. The disruption causes an imbalance. The imbalance results in a proliferation of harmful bacteria. Sickness is accompanied by symptoms: fever, sweating, a runny nose, throwing up, and intestinal issues. Symptoms are the body's method of killing off and throwing off harmful bacteria. When the population of bad bacteria is reduced, the T cells come out and finish off what's left. Then our bodies return to homeostasis, which our bodies are always trying to maintain. In the future, that is, in the new millennium, because I can see these things, there will be a return to natural forms of medicine. People in future generations will look back on our generation and the allopathic approach to medicine with dismay and in horror. Now, back to my story. What caused my bout with COVID and my long COVID was, as I mentioned, a poison. The poison was in the form of a bioengineered spiked protein. This synthetic protein is similar to various kinds of snake venom. My new friend told me he learned this from watching Dr. Brian Ardis videos. According to Dr. Ardis, the reason we know it's not a virus, but a poison, is because that's what they find in the acetylcholine receptors when they autopsy people who've died from COVID and from long COVID. Like snake venom, these synthetic spike proteins that have been unleashed on the world get into your acetylcholine receptors and prevent them from producing sufficient amounts of acetylcholine. This prevents affected cells from producing sufficient amounts of energy. My tiredness, muscle pain, brain fog, stomach problems, heart palpitations, and all the other horrors I experienced, all of them can be attributed to a lack of acetylcholine. Depending on your age, your genetic makeup, and the extent to which you've been dosed, you may or may not have been affected, or you may be affected to a greater or lesser degree. The antidote my friend told me to take is nicotine. That's because the primary acetylcholine receptors that are affected are the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. These receptors have the greatest affinity for nicotine, thus the name. When nicotine is introduced, the spike protein is released in favor of nicotine. With the key in place, the receptor begins to work again. Thus, your cells begin producing acetylcholine again, and thus you have energy again. Now, since everyone is different, the nicotine remedy may or may not work for everyone. But for me, the results were instantaneous, within not minutes, but seconds of having put a little piece of nicotine gum in my mouth. The tension in my abdomen instantly resolved. The heavy feeling of tiredness instantly resolved. And the pain in my neck and my shoulder instantly resolved. It was the most interesting sensation because it unexpectedly happened so quickly. But since I've never smoked, and since I'm not around smokers, the gum was way too strong for me. It made me nauseous and dizzy. Even though I felt a ton better, I couldn't stand up for an hour. So instead of continuing to chew the gum, I switched to a 7 milligram nicotine patch for 6 days. This is the protocol that Dr. Ardis recommends. Within a couple of days, my other symptoms subsided. My sense of smell and taste returned. My brain fog cleared, and my heart palpitations resolved. In the weeks leading up to my nicotine treatment, I had become increasingly more forgetful. I would get up from my desk and go into the kitchen to get something. But by the time I got there, I couldn't remember what it was I got up to get. So I'd just go back to my office, empty-handed and out of breath. I couldn't even remember my password from one day to the next. Credentials I had used every day for months eluded me. I had Post-it notes everywhere. But after having worn the nicotine patch, I caught myself writing myself a note. It had become a habit. But then I realized this practice was no longer necessary. My mind was sharp again. Once again, I could easily remember things. Now, I had always heard that nicotine is a poisonous, addictive substance. Consequently, I was more than a little bit hesitant to try it. And other sufferers of long COVID I've recommended this treatment to won't try it for this reason. But unlike the other people who were afraid to try it, who perished for lack of knowledge, Hosea 4:6, I did the research for myself. I learned that what I had heard all my life isn't entirely true. In fact, it's not true at all. Sure, nicotine can be problematic if you abuse it. But consider this. Nicotine is a natural substance. It's not just in tobacco, it's in lots of things like eggplant, tomatoes, potatoes, and even spinach. In small amounts, it's a beneficial substance. A 7 milligram patch that's released over a 24-hour period is not a lot of nicotine. It's less nicotine than what's in one cigarette. And strong cigarettes contain several times 7 milligrams. After my 6-day treatment, I started wearing the patch once a week for maintenance. But that wasn't quite enough. I kept running out of gas before the end of the week. What works best for me now is half of a 7 milligram patch every other day. But since everyone is different, you'll have to work with it yourself in order to figure out what works the best for you. Berberine is another supplement I stumbled onto. It clears out the insulin receptors similar to the way the nicotine does. During the time I was sick with long COVID, I also had become pre-diabetic. For me, berberine got me back to normal. But once again, it may not work for everyone. You should do the research for yourself. Full disclosure, even though the nicotine patch brought me back from the verge of death, most days I'm still only about 75% of where I was before I had COVID. Also, I have to say, I'm not a doctor. The content in this video is for informational purposes only. It's not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Always seek the advice of your doctor if you have any questions regarding your health or medical condition. Next time, I'll tell you how the Lord intervened and is dealing with me financially. It wasn't what I expected. Since the Lord's ways are not our ways, it's rare that things ever happen the way we would expect. But that's also what makes our walk with the Lord so very fascinating. My book, The Spiritual Christian, Volume 1, The Desert, is still under construction. But that's because the Lord's timing is not mine. I'm somewhat of a passenger. It's taking me a lot longer than I anticipated, but I am making a lot of progress on it now. My other book, The Exchanged, is a Christian-based psychological thriller. It's also taking me longer than anticipated. The story that came to me is a gift from the Lord. It will be a very successful book. I can see that. But I'm having to rework some things right now. I'm a bit of a perfectionist when I write. Next time, next step. Again, if you haven't already subscribed, be sure and do so now. That way you don't miss a single video. Can't wait until next time. Like me on Facebook and visit me at michaelramseybooks.com.